In a small, quiet town in the southern United States, life moved at a predictable pace. The streets were lined with modest homes, and local businesses that had been there for generations stood as landmarks of familiarity. Everyone knew each other, or so they thought. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community, tension simmered, waiting for a spark to ignite. And one sunny Tuesday afternoon, that spark came in the form of an incident that would leave the town talking for years. It all started when a call came into the police station about vandalism near the town's main park. Someone had spray-painted graffiti on the side of a historic building, a brick structure that dated back to the early 1900s. The caller sounded upset, claiming it was disrespectful and demanding immediate action. Officer Mike Reynolds, a seasoned but increasingly frustrated cop, was assigned to handle the situation. He grabbed his hat, got into his patrol car, and headed to the scene, not knowing how much this day would change his life and the lives of others. When Officer Reynolds arrived, he spotted a girl standing near the building. She looked no older than 15, with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a can of spray paint dangling loosely from her hand. Her name was Tasha, though. He didn't know that yet. What he did notice was her attitude. She stood tall, almost defiant, refusing to meet his gaze or answer his questions. "Did you do this?" Reynolds asked, pointing to the graffiti. Tasha didn't respond. She just stared past him, her expression unreadable. Reynolds tried again, his voice rising slightly. "Look, I'm giving you a chance to explain yourself. That's vandalism. You know it's illegal, right?" Still nothing. No words, no reaction. Just silence. Frustration bubbled inside him. Over the years, he'd dealt with plenty of difficult people, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the way she ignored him, or maybe it was the weight of everything else going on in his life. Whatever it was, it pushed him over the edge. In a split-second decision he would later regret, he reached into his patrol car, pulled out a roll of duct tape, and secured Tasha's hands, together. Then, without thinking twice, he taped her to a nearby utility pole. "There," he said, stepping back. "Now you'll have some time to think about what you've done." He left her there, intending to teach her a lesson about respect and authority while he went inside the building to investigate further. What he didn't realize was that this impulsive act would set off a chain reaction neither he nor anyone else could have anticipated. Little did he know, Tasha wasn't just any teenager. And her father, well, he was someone whose presence in the town carried more weight than Reynolds could ever imagine. As cars drove by and neighbors walked their dogs, people began to notice the girl tied to the pole. Some stopped to ask what was happening. Others whipped out their phones to take pictures. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Before long, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Among them was a man who worked at the auto repair shop down the street. Tall and broad-shouldered, he couldn't believe what he was seeing, a young black girl bound to a pole in broad daylight. Anger flared within him, and he stepped forward, ready to demand answers. But before he could say anything, another figure appeared. This man walked with purpose, his eyes locked on the scene ahead. His name wasn't widely known outside the community, but those who did know him understood the significance of his arrival. It was Tasha's father, a man who had spent most of his life trying to keep his family out of trouble. But now, seeing his daughter humiliated and restrained, something inside him shifted. Without hesitation, he approached Officer Reynolds, his voice steady but firm. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, gesturing toward Tasha. Officer Reynolds turned, startled. For the first time, he realized the gravity of what he'd done and the storm he had unknowingly unleashed. The man standing before Officer Reynolds was calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. His voice carried a weight that demanded attention, and the crowd around them fell silent, watching every move. "What is the meaning of this?" he repeated, pointing to Tasha, who was still duct-taped to the pole. Her head was down now, her face hidden behind strands of hair, but her father's presence seemed to give her strength. She raised her chin slightly, meeting his gaze for just a moment before looking away. Officer Reynolds hesitated. For the first time since he'd arrived at the scene, he felt unsure of himself. "Sir, your daughter, she was caught vandalizing public property," he said, gesturing toward the graffiti-covered building. "I'm just trying to handle the situation." "Handle it?" the man shot back, his voice rising. "You call this handling it? Tying my child to a pole like she's some kind of criminal? Do you even know who she is?" The officer opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. He didn't know anything about Tasha or her family. All he knew was that she hadn't answered his questions and had seemed uncooperative. But now, faced with her father's anger and the growing crowd of onlookers, he realized how reckless his actions had been. The duct tape around Tasha's wrists suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Before Reynolds could say another word, the man stepped closer, his tone sharp but controlled. "Untie her, right now." For a second, no one moved. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, reluctantly, Officer Reynolds walked over to the pole and began unwrapping the duct tape. Tasha winced as the sticky material pulled at her skin, but she didn't make a sound. When she was finally free, her father immediately pulled her close, wrapping an arm protectively around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, though her eyes were red and swollen. It was clear she'd been holding back tears. By now, the crowd had grown larger. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others filming the scene on their phones. One woman shouted, "This isn't right," while a man nearby muttered something about calling the news station. Word was spreading fast, and Officer Reynolds could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Later that evening, images of Tasha tied to the pole began circulating online. Social media lit up with outrage. Hashtags like "Earn Justice for Her" and "End Police Brutality" trended locally, then nationally. News outlets picked up the story, turning it into a headline that dominated conversations across the country. Back at home, Tasha sat quietly on the couch, staring at the floor. Her mother paced nervously, clutching her phone as notifications buzzed nonstop. Reporters had already started showing up outside their house, knocking on doors and asking for interviews. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering about what they'd seen earlier that day. Tasha's father, meanwhile, sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. For years, he'd worked hard to keep his family out of trouble, avoiding anything that might draw unnecessary attention. But now, thanks to one officer's poor judgment, they were at the center of a national controversy. "I never wanted this," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. His wife stopped pacing and looked at him. "None of us did," she replied gently. "But maybe this is bigger than us. Maybe it's not just about Tasha anymore." He glanced up at her, surprised by her words. She was right, of course. This wasn't just about their daughter. It was about every kid who felt unseen or unheard because of the color of their skin. It was about the countless times people in their community had brushed off incidents like this, chalking them up to misunderstandings or isolated mistakes. And it was about the systemic issues that allowed such moments to happen in the first place. The next morning, the town woke up to protests. Dozens of residents gathered near the park where the incident had occurred, holding signs that read, "Accountability now and protect our kids." Some marched silently while others chanted slogans calling for justice. Among them were parents, teachers, students, and activists, all united by a shared sense of frustration and determination. At the police station, Officer Reynolds sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. He hadn't slept all night. Images of Tasha's face kept flashing in his mind, haunting him. What had he been thinking? Why hadn't he handled things differently? He replayed the events over and over again, searching for answers but finding none. His colleagues avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. A few muttered under their breath about how the media was blowing things out of proportion, but most stayed quiet. Even Chief Harris, usually quick to defend his officers, seemed uneasy. He called Reynolds into his office and told him he was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. "I don't think you meant harm," Chief Harris said, leaning back in his chair. But we can't ignore the fact that this has blown up into something much bigger than either of us expected. Reynolds nodded numbly. He knew the chief was right, but that didn't make the reality any easier to swallow. As he left the office, reporters swarmed him, shoving microphones in his face and shouting questions. He pushed past them without saying a word, climbing into his car and driving away as quickly as possible. That evening, Tasha's father received a phone call from a local activist group. They wanted to meet with him and his family to discuss next steps. At first, he was hesitant. The idea of stepping into the public eye terrified him. But then he thought about Tasha, the way she'd stood so bravely despite everything, and realized he owed it to her to try. "We'll do it," he told the caller firmly. "But only if Tasha agrees." When he asked her later that night, she surprised him by nodding. "Okay," she said softly. "But I want to tell my own story." Her courage filled him with pride and resolve. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The meeting with the activist group took place in a small community center on the edge of town. It was a modest space, with peeling paint on the walls and mismatched chairs arranged in a circle. But despite its humble appearance, the room buzzed with energy. People from all walks of life had gathered, parents, teachers, students, and local leaders, all united by a shared desire for change. Tasha's father sat at the center of the circle, his posture stiff but determined. Beside him, Tasha clutched her mother's hand tightly, her knuckles white. She looked smaller than she had that day at the park, as though the weight of everything happening around her was pressing down hard. Her mother, too, seemed uneasy, glancing nervously at the growing crowd filling the seats. One of the activists, an older woman with kind eyes and a voice full of warmth, opened the discussion. "Thank you all for coming," she began, addressing the room. "What happened here shook us, not just because it involved a young girl, but because it exposed truths we've been ignoring for far too long." Her words hung in the air, heavy, yet undeniable. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone nodded vigorously. Another wiped away tears. When it was Tasha's father's turn to speak, he cleared his throat and leaned forward. "I never wanted my family to be part of something like this," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But now that we are, I can't stay silent. Not when so many others have gone through worse and gotten no justice." He paused, looking directly at Tasha before continuing. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore. It's about every child who feels targeted or dismissed because of how they look. If telling our story helps even one person feel seen, then it's worth it." The room erupted into applause, soft at first, but building momentum until it filled the entire space. For the first time since the incident, Tasha allowed herself a small smile. Her father's words made her feel stronger, braver, as though she wasn't alone in carrying the burden of what had happened. Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. News crews descended on the town, setting up cameras outside, the park, the police station, and even Tasha's home. Reporters knocked on doors asking neighbors for comments. Some declined to speak, while others offered opinions ranging from outrage to disbelief. One elderly man who lived 2 blocks away told a journalist, "It's sad, really. This town used to be peaceful, but maybe peaceful doesn't mean fair." Meanwhile, social media became a battleground. Supporters rallied behind hashtags like "Stand with her" and "Change starts now," sharing posts calling for accountability and reform. Critics argued that Officer Reynolds had simply been doing his job, accusing the public of rushing to judgment without knowing the full story. The divide grew wider with each passing hour. Amid the chaos, Tasha found herself thrust into the spotlight. Friends texted her messages of support, while strangers sent letters and cards expressing solidarity. At school, kids whispered as she walked down the hallways, some offering hugs, others casting sideways glances. Teachers tiptoed around the topic during class, unsure of how to address it without making things worse. Her parents did their best to shield her from the noise, but it was impossible to ignore completely. Late one night, unable to sleep, Tasha scrolled through her phone, reading comment after comment online. Most were kind, encouraging her to keep speaking out. But there were cruel ones too. Messages questioning why she'd been holding spray paint in the first place or accusing her of bringing the situation on herself. She showed the hurtful comments to her mother, who sighed deeply. People will always try to twist things to fit their own narratives, she said, pulling Tasha close. Don't let them take your truth away from you. As the week wore on, pressure mounted on the police department to take action. Protesters gathered daily outside the station, chanting slogans and holding signs demanding justice. Local businesses displayed posters in their windows, showing solidarity with Tasha and her family. Even the mayor issued a statement acknowledging the need for open conversations about race, policing, and accountability. Inside the station, tensions ran high. Officers avoided discussing the case openly, but whispers traveled fast. Some defended Reynolds, insisting he'd acted out of frustration rather than malice. Others admitted privately that tying a teenager to a pole crossed a line, no matter the circumstances. Chief Harris called an emergency meeting with his staff, urging them to reflect on the bigger picture. We're not just law enforcement. We're part of this community, he reminded them. And right now, our community is hurting. We need to show them we hear them. By the end of the meeting, a decision was made. Officer Reynolds would issue a public apology. It wasn't enough to satisfy everyone, but it was a start, a small step toward rebuilding trust. On Friday evening, the apology came. Standing in front of a podium surrounded by reporters, Reynolds read a prepared statement. His hands trembled, slightly as he spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. I regret my actions that day, he said, looking down at his notes. They were wrong, and I take full responsibility. I hope to learn from this experience and do better moving forward. The crowd listened silently, some nodding in approval, others crossing their arms skeptically. When he finished, a reporter shouted, "Do you think an apology is enough?" Reynolds hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it's not," he admitted. "But I'm willing to listen, to understand where I went wrong, and to make amends however I can." His words may not have healed every wound, but they signaled a shift, a recognition that change needed to happen, starting with him. Back at home, Tasha watched the apology on TV with her family. When it ended, she turned to her father. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly. He thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I do believe people can change, if they truly want to." For now, that was enough. Change wouldn't come overnight, but the seeds had been planted. And as Tasha curled up on the couch beside her mother that night, she felt a flicker of hope, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could still find its way through. The days following Officer Reynolds' apology were a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. While some in the town saw his words as a step toward healing, others remained skeptical, unwilling to forgive so quickly. For Tasha and her family, life felt like a balancing act, trying to navigate the public spotlight while grappling with their own feelings about what had happened. Tasha's father spent hours on the phone with lawyers, activists, and community leaders, discussing next steps. He knew this moment was bigger than just one officer's mistake. It was an opportunity to push for real change. But he also worried about protecting his daughter from becoming a symbol instead of a person. "I don't want her to feel like she has to carry the weight of the world," he told his wife late one night sitting at the kitchen table. "She's still just a kid." His wife nodded, sipping her tea. "But maybe that's why people are listening now," she said softly. "Because it's not just about systems or policies, it's about her, about how we treat each other as human beings." Meanwhile, Tasha began opening up more about what she'd experienced that day. With encouragement from her parents and the activist group, she agreed to share her story publicly. It wasn't easy. Every time she thought about speaking out, nerves bubbled in her stomach. What if people judged her? What if they didn't believe her? But then she remembered the messages of support she'd received, the strangers who said her courage gave them strength, and decided it was worth the risk. The first interview took place in their living room, a space that felt safe and familiar. A local journalist sat across from Tasha, notebook in hand, asking gentle questions. "Can you tell us what happened that day?" she asked, giving Tasha plenty of time to respond. Tasha hesitated at first, fiddling with the hem of her shirt. Then, taking a deep breath, she began. "I was walking home from school when I saw the graffiti on the building," she said slowly. "I stopped to look at it because, well, it caught my attention. Before I could even process what was happening, the officer came up to me and started accusing me of doing it. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen." Her voice wavered slightly, but she kept going. "Then he taped me to the pole. I felt humiliated, like I wasn't even a person anymore. Just someone he could do whatever he wanted to without caring about how it made me feel." When she finished, the journalist thanked her, visibly moved. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said sincerely. "It takes a lot of bravery to speak out like this." Later, when the interview aired, it resonated deeply with viewers. People commented on how Tasha's honesty highlighted the larger issue, the lack of trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Her words became a rallying cry for those demanding accountability, not just for her case, but for countless others like it. As momentum built, the town organized a series of meetings aimed at fostering dialogue. The first gathering took place in the high school auditorium, drawing hundreds of residents eager to participate. Chairs filled quickly, spilling into the aisles and hallways. Some attendees wore buttons or carried signs reading, "Justice starts here," and "We see you." Tasha's father attended alongside his wife and daughter, though Tasha chose to sit quietly near the back, overwhelmed by the crowd. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped onto the stage, gripping the microphone tightly. "This isn't just about one incident," he began, his voice strong but measured. "It's about patterns, generations of being treated as less than, of having our voices dismissed or ignored. My daughter stood there tied to a pole, but imagine how many others have felt that same helplessness without anyone noticing." Paused, scanning the audience. "We can't fix everything overnight, but we can start by listening to each other, to our kids, to the pain we've been too afraid to confront. That's where change begins." His speech earned a standing ovation, with many wiping away tears. One woman approached him afterward, thanking him for putting words to feelings she'd struggled to express. "You're giving us hope," she said simply. Behind closed doors, negotiations continued. Lawyers representing both sides worked tirelessly to reach a resolution. Settlement talks included discussions about compensation for Tasha and her family, as well as measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, city officials scrambled to draft new policies aimed at improving police-community relations. For Officer Reynolds, the fallout weighed heavily. Suspended indefinitely, he spent his days reflecting on his actions. Friends avoided calling, unsure of what to say, while neighbors whispered behind his back. At night, he replayed the scene over and over in his mind, wondering how he could have handled things differently. Slowly, he began attending counseling sessions, hoping to understand the biases that had clouded his judgment. One evening, during a particularly raw session, his therapist asked, "Do you think this experience will change how you interact with people moving forward?" Reynolds hesitated before answering. "I hope so," he admitted, "but I know it's not enough to just say I'm sorry. I have to prove it, with my actions." Back in the community, progress came in small but meaningful ways. Schools introduced workshops on racial sensitivity, led by experts brought in to facilitate difficult conversations. Local businesses hosted events celebrating diversity, inviting residents to share stories and traditions. Even the police department launched training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural competency. Through it all, Tasha remained at the heart of the movement. Though she preferred staying out of the limelight, her willingness to speak out inspired others to do the same. Kids at school started opening up about their own experiences with discrimination, finding strength in solidarity. Teachers noticed a shift, a newfound sense of empathy among students who once seemed divided. One afternoon, Tasha's mother found her sketching in her notebook. Curious, she peeked over her shoulder and saw drawings of hands reaching out to one another, surrounded by words like hope, justice, and together. Smiling, she placed a hand on Tasha's shoulder. "Looks like you're already making a difference," she said. Tasha shrugged, smiling faintly. "Maybe," she replied. "But I think it's everyone else doing the work. I'm just telling my truth." And perhaps that was the most powerful thing of all. A reminder that sometimes speaking your truth is enough to spark change. The town continued to buzz with activity as the weeks turned into months. Conversations that had started in living rooms and school hallways now spilled into public spaces, parks, coffee shops, even grocery store aisles. People who had once avoided discussing race or inequality found themselves drawn into debates they couldn't ignore. It wasn't always comfortable. Sometimes tempers flared, and old wounds reopened. But for the first time in a long while, there was momentum, a collective push toward understanding. Tasha's story became a catalyst for change, but it also uncovered deeper layers of pain within the community. At one meeting held inside the local library, an older woman stood up to share her experience. Her voice trembled as she recounted how her son had been stopped by police years ago for no reason other than the color of his skin. "He was just walking home from work," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They made him sit on the curb like a criminal. He never got over it." Her words struck a chord. Others nodded knowingly, some raising their hands to add their own stories. A young man spoke about being followed around stores simply because of how he looked. A teacher shared how her students often expressed fear of authority figures, unsure if they'd be treated fairly. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a clearer picture of systemic issues that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Tasha's father listened intently, his jaw clenched. He realized then that this wasn't just about his daughter. It was about generations of people carrying burdens they shouldn't have had to bear. As much as he wanted to protect Tasha from the weight of it all, he knew she couldn't turn away. She was part of something bigger now, whether any of them liked it or not. In the midst of these discussions, Officer Reynolds quietly returned to work after completing mandatory sensitivity training. His return sparked mixed reactions. Some residents welcomed him back cautiously, acknowledging that everyone deserved a second chance. Others remained angry, convinced his apology hadn't been sincere. For Reynolds himself, coming back felt like stepping onto shaky ground. Every interaction with the public left him hyper-aware of how closely he was being watched. One afternoon, while patrolling near the park where everything had unfolded, he spotted a group of kids playing basketball. They glanced at him briefly before turning their attention back to the game. He hesitated, then approached them slowly. "Hey," he called out, trying to sound friendly. "Mind if I join?" The kids exchanged glances, unsure what to make of his offer. Finally, one of them shrugged. "Sure, why not?" For the next 20 minutes, Reynolds played alongside them, laughing when someone missed a shot and cheering when another scored. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress, a small step toward rebuilding trust. When the game ended, one of the boys muttered a quiet thanks before running off with his friends. Reynolds stood there for a moment, feeling a flicker of hope. At school, Tasha noticed subtle changes too. Teachers began addressing topics like bias and privilege during class discussions, encouraging students to think critically about the world around them. Posters went up in the hallways promoting kindness and inclusivity. Even the principal organized assemblies featuring guest speakers who talked about overcoming adversity and standing up for what's right. But not everyone was on board. Some parents complained, accusing the school of pushing a political agenda. One student mocked Tasha in the cafeteria, saying sarcastically, "So, are you famous now?" Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but instead of retreating, she squared her shoulders and replied, "No, I'm just trying to make things better. You should try it sometime." Her boldness earned murmurs of approval from nearby classmates. Word spread quickly, and soon others started standing up to bullies or calling out unfair treatment when they saw it. Tasha may not have realized it, but her courage was contagious. Meanwhile, the activist group working with Tasha's family pushed forward with plans to create lasting change. They proposed reforms ranging from stricter accountability measures for law enforcement to increased funding for youth programs aimed at fostering leadership and empathy. City council meetings grew crowded as residents showed up to voice their support or opposition to the ideas. During one particularly heated session, tensions ran high. A man stood up, slamming his fist on the podium. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're punishing good officers because of one bad decision." Before anyone could respond, a teenage girl seated in the audience rose to her feet. She introduced herself as a classmate of Tasha's and spoke calmly but firmly. "It's not about punishing anyone," she said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. If we don't learn from our mistakes, nothing will ever change." Her words silenced the room. The man sat back down, visibly shaken, while others clapped in agreement. Slowly, the conversation shifted, from blame to solutions, from division to collaboration. As winter approached, the town prepared for a special event, a unity march organized by the activist group. Flyers were posted all over town, inviting everyone to participate. On the day of the march, hundreds gathered in the park where Tasha had been duct-taped to the pole. This time, though, the atmosphere was different, hopeful rather than tense. Tasha walked alongside her parents, holding a sign that read, "Together we rise." Around her, people carried banners and chanted slogans calling for justice and equality. Strangers linked arms, smiling at one another despite their differences. Even Officer Reynolds attended, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching as the community came together in a way he'd never seen before. When the march ended, Tasha's father took the microphone to address the crowd. "Today proves that we're stronger when we stand united," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We still have a long road ahead, but if we keep listening and learning from each other, I believe we can build a future where no child has to feel afraid or unseen." The crowd erupted into cheers, hugging and shaking hands as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in months, Tasha allowed herself to relax, leaning against her mother as fireworks lit up the sky. Change wouldn't come overnight, but tonight, at least, it felt possible. The Unity March marked a turning point for the town, but it wasn't the end of the journey. It was more like the beginning of a new chapter. In the weeks that followed, people carried the energy from that day into their everyday lives. Conversations about fairness and respect became less awkward and more natural. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started waving hello or stopping for quick chats. The sense of division that had lingered for so long began to fade, replaced by a fragile yet hopeful connection. Tasha's family found themselves at the center of this shift, though they still struggled with balancing their newfound role in the community with their desire for normalcy. Tasha's father often joked that he felt like he'd been thrust into a leadership position he hadn't asked for. "I'm just a regular guy trying to raise my kid," he told his wife one evening, as they sat on the porch. "But I guess if people are listening, we might as well say something worth hearing." His wife smiled, nudging him gently. "You're doing great," she said. "And you're not alone. Look how many people are stepping up now." She was right. More residents were getting involved, volunteering their time to organize workshops, mentor young people, or simply lend an ear to those who needed it. Even businesses joined in, offering free services or hosting events aimed at bringing people together. A local bakery began donating pastries to after-school programs, while a bookstore set aside a section featuring authors from diverse backgrounds. Small gestures, maybe, but they added up. For Tasha, life slowly started to feel lighter. She still faced challenges, snide comments here, suspicious stares there, but she also noticed moments of unexpected kindness. One afternoon, as she walked home from school, a woman stopped her to say thank you. "Your courage means a lot to us," the woman said warmly. "Keep going." Tasha nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. These interactions reminded her why sharing her story mattered, not because she wanted attention, but because it gave others permission to share theirs too. At school, friends she hadn't expected rallied around her, defending her when someone made a rude remark or inviting her to join activities she'd usually avoid. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. Even her teachers seemed different, making an effort to check in with her regularly. One day, her English teacher handed back an essay Tasha had written about resilience. Across the top, she'd scribbled, "This is powerful. Keep writing. It gives voice to what others can't say." Tasha tucked the paper into her notebook, smiling to herself. Maybe she didn't have all the answers, but she was starting to see that her words could make a difference. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds continued navigating the complexities of his return to duty. Some days were better than others. He'd earned cautious nods of approval from colleagues who appreciated his willingness to learn, but distrust lingered among certain residents. During a routine traffic stop, a driver rolled down his window and stared at Reynolds with cold eyes. "Aren't you the guy who tied that girl to a pole?" he asked bluntly. Reynolds swallowed hard, meeting the man's gaze. "Yes, sir," he replied evenly. "And I'm sorry for what happened. I'm working to do better." The driver studied him for a moment before nodding curtly and handing over his license. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and that was something. Reynolds realized then that rebuilding trust would take time, patience, and consistency. Every interaction mattered, no matter how small. He threw himself into training sessions designed to address implicit bias and improve communication skills. At first, he resisted some of the exercises, finding them uncomfortable. But as he listened to facilitators and fellow officers share personal stories, he began to understand the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths. One particularly impactful session involved role-playing scenarios where participants took turns acting as both law enforcement and civilians. By the end, Reynolds left with a deeper appreciation for how fear and misunderstanding could escalate quickly. Back in the community, efforts to implement lasting change gained traction. City officials approved funding for a youth leadership program aimed at empowering teens to advocate for themselves and their peers. Workshops focused on topics like conflict resolution, public speaking, and organizing peaceful protests. Tasha signed up immediately, eager to connect with others who shared her passion for justice. During one session, she teamed up with a group of classmates to brainstorm ways to improve relationships between students and school administrators. Their idea, a monthly listening circle, where kids could voice concerns without judgment, was met with enthusiasm. Within weeks, the initiative launched, drawing praise from parents and educators alike. "It's amazing what happens when you give young people a platform," Tasha's mother remarked proudly after attending one of the circles. "They have so much wisdom." Her father agreed, though he couldn't help teasing Tasha afterward. "Next thing you know, you'll be running for mayor," he joked, ruffling her hair. She laughed, rolling her eyes. "Yeah, right. I'll stick to listening. Circles for now." As spring approached, the town held its annual festival, a tradition dating back decades. This year, however, organizers decided to dedicate part of the event to celebrating diversity and inclusion. Booths lined the streets, showcasing art, music, and food from various cultures represented in the community. Kids played games while parents browsed stalls selling handmade crafts and books promoting empathy and understanding. At the center of it all stood a mural painted by local artists, inspired by Tasha's story. Bold colors swirled together, forming images of hands reaching out, flowers blooming, and words like hope, unity, and justice woven throughout. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Dedicated to every voice brave enough to speak out and every heart open enough to listen." Tasha stood in front of the mural, overwhelmed by emotion. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "Look at what you've helped create," he said softly. She shook her head, smiling through tears. "Not me. All of us." And that was the truth. While Tasha's story had sparked the movement, it was the collective effort of countless individuals that kept it alive. Together, they were proving that even in the face of pain and injustice, healing was possible, if only people were willing to come together and try. The mural quickly became a symbol of hope for the town. People would stop by just to look at it, taking photos or simply sitting on the bench nearby to reflect. Some left notes or small tokens, flowers, stones painted with kind messages, even handwritten letters tucked into cracks in the wall. It was as if the mural had created a space where people could leave behind pieces of themselves, sharing their thoughts and emotions without needing to say a word. Tasha visited the mural often, sometimes alone and sometimes with friends. She liked watching how it changed over time, how rain softened its edges, how sunlight made the colors glow brighter. Each visit reminded her of how far they'd come since that day at the park, but it also reminded her of how much work still lay ahead. Change wasn't something you could finish. It was something you kept working on, day after day. One afternoon, as she stood there tracing her fingers along the painted hands, an older man approached her. He wore a faded baseball cap and carried a cane, his steps slow but steady. "You're her, aren't you?" he asked, nodding toward the plaque beneath the mural. His voice was warm, almost grandfatherly. Tasha nodded shyly. "Yeah, I guess so." The man smiled, leaning on his cane. "I used to live around here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the neighborhood behind them. "Moved away years ago, but I heard about what happened. Came back to see this." He pointed to the mural. "It's beautiful. You know, when I was your age, things weren't easy either. Not for folks who looked like us." Tasha tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, you'd think times have changed, but some things stay the same. Back then we didn't have hashtags or cameras in our pockets. We had marches and sit-ins, sure, but mostly we had each other. That's what got us through." His words lingered in Tasha's mind long after he shuffled away. She realized then that while her story felt unique to her, it was part of something much bigger, a thread woven into the fabric of history. The struggles her family faced weren't new, but neither was the resilience they showed in fighting back. Knowing that gave her strength, even on days when doubt crept in. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds continued grappling with his place in the community. He'd started volunteering at a local youth center, helping kids with homework or coaching basketball during open gym nights. At first, the teens were hesitant to engage with him, whispering jokes or avoiding eye contact. But slowly, they began warming up, especially after he shared stories about his own childhood, how he'd grown up poor, dreaming of becoming a cop because he wanted to make a difference. "I thought being a police officer meant protecting people," he told a group of boys one evening as they shot hoops. "But I've learned it's not enough to want to help. You have to listen too, and I'm still learning." One of the boys dribbled the ball awkwardly before passing it to him. "So, does that mean you're sorry for real? Or is this just like PR stuff?" Reynolds caught the ball, pausing to think. "Both, maybe," he admitted. "At first, yeah, I did it because I had to. But now I really mean it. I don't expect everyone to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me either. But I can try to do better. That's all any of us can do." The boy shrugged, then grinned, faintly. "Cool, just don't mess up again, okay?" Reynolds laughed, tossing the ball back. "Deal." Back at home, Tasha's father found himself reflecting on his own journey. Growing up, he'd always tried to shield his family from trouble, believing that keeping their heads down would keep them safe. But life had taught him otherwise. Sometimes staying silent only made things worse. Speaking out might be scary, but it was also necessary. If not for yourself, then for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He shared these thoughts during a panel discussion hosted by the activist group. Sitting alongside parents, educators, and community leaders, he spoke candidly about the challenges of raising a child in a world that often felt stacked against them. "We teach our kids to dream big," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we also have to prepare them for disappointment, for moments when the world doesn't see their worth. And honestly, that's the hardest part." When the audience erupted into applause, he blinked back tears, surprised by the overwhelming support. Afterward, strangers came up to shake his hand or hug him, thanking him for putting words to feelings they'd struggled to express. For the first time, he understood why his daughter had been so determined to share her story. It wasn't just about her. It was about giving others permission to heal. As summer approached, the town held another event, a storytelling night under the stars. Residents gathered in the park, blankets spread across the grass, lanterns glowing softly overhead. One by one, people took turns stepping onto a makeshift stage to share their experiences, moments of triumph, heartbreak, and everything in between. A young girl talked about standing up to bullies at school. A teacher recounted how a student's bravery inspired her to rethink her lesson plans. Even Officer Reynolds joined in, recounting the first time he realized he needed to change, not just for himself, but for the sake of the community he served. When it was Tasha's turn, she walked to the microphone, clutching a notebook filled with scribbled thoughts. For a moment she hesitated, staring out at the sea of faces illuminated by candlelight. Then she began to speak, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each sentence. "This year has been hard," she admitted. "Really hard. But it's also shown me that people care, that even when things seem impossible, we can find ways to come together. So tonight I want to say thank you to everyone who listened, who stood beside me, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." By the time she finished, the crowd was on its feet, cheering and clapping until their hands hurt. Tasha stepped off the stage, hugging her parents tightly as tears streamed down her face. For once, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She knew she wasn't alone. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky to celebrate the end of the event, Tasha sat cross-legged on the grass, staring up at the bursts of color. Her mother leaned over, wrapping an arm around her. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly. Tasha thought for a moment before answering. "Hopeful," she said finally. "Like maybe things can get better. Not perfect, but better." Her mother kissed the top of her head, smiling. "That's all we can ask for, sweetheart. Better." And as the echoes of laughter and music filled the air, it felt like the town had taken another step forward, not toward perfection, but toward understanding. Together, they were proving that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through, if only people were willing to let it. As the months rolled by, the town settled into a new rhythm. Life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings, and frustrations. But there was also a sense of progress that hadn't existed before. Conversations about fairness, respect, and accountability became part of the fabric of daily life. People weren't afraid to ask hard questions or admit when they didn't have all the answers. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was real, and sometimes that was enough. Tasha's family found themselves adjusting to their evolving role in the community. Her father continued attending meetings and speaking at events, though he often joked that he'd never imagined becoming an advocate for change. "I'm just a guy trying to raise my kid," he'd say with a laugh. But deep down he knew his voice mattered, not because it was louder than anyone else's, but because it came from the heart. He wanted Tasha to grow up in a world where she felt safe and valued, and if sharing their story could help make that happen, he was willing to keep showing up. Her mother, too, played her part in quieter ways. She organized book clubs focused on stories about resilience and empathy, inviting neighbors over for coffee and conversation. Over time, these gatherings turned into something more, a space where people could talk openly about their fears, hopes, and dreams without judgment. One evening, as the group discussed a novel about overcoming adversity, a woman leaned forward and said, "You know, I used to think things like this only happened somewhere else, but now I realize we're not so different from those places. We've got work to do." Everyone nodded in agreement, including Tasha's mother, who smiled softly. "That's true," she replied, "but we're doing it together, and that makes all the difference." For Tasha, life began to feel lighter again. The attention she'd received after the incident had waned, giving way to a quieter kind of normalcy. At school, she joined a leadership club aimed at fostering understanding among students. Together, they planned activities like cultural exchange days and peer mentoring programs, encouraging classmates to step outside their comfort zones and connect with one another. One project stood out: a wall of kindness, where students could leave anonymous notes of encouragement for each other. Within days, the wall was covered in colorful sticky notes filled with messages like, "You're stronger than you think," and "Your voice matters." When Tasha walked past it during lunch, she couldn't help smiling. Maybe they couldn't fix everything overnight, but small acts of kindness added up. Even her relationship with Officer Reynolds shifted in unexpected ways. Though she hadn't forgiven him completely, and didn't feel obligated to, she noticed how much effort he put into making amends. During a school career day, he gave a presentation about law enforcement, answering tough questions from students with honesty and humility. When someone asked what he'd learned from the incident, he paused, then said, "That listening is just as important as acting, sometimes even more." Afterward, Tasha approached him cautiously. "That was good," she admitted, surprising both of them. Reynolds looked taken aback, but grateful. "Thanks," he said simply. "I mean it. I'm still learning, but I want to do better." She nodded, unsure of what else to say, but the brief exchange felt significant. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but maybe understanding was a start. The town marked the one-year anniversary of the incident with a reflection event held near the mural. Residents gathered to share memories, celebrate progress, and acknowledge the challenges that remained. A stage was set up, decorated with flowers and string lights, while speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Tasha's father spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. "A year ago, we were hurting," he began. "We felt angry, scared, and unsure of what the future held, but today I see hope. Not because everything is fixed, far from it, but because we're working toward something better. Together." When he stepped down, Tasha surprised everyone by taking the microphone next. She hadn't planned to speak, but standing there, surrounded by familiar faces, she realized she had something to say. "This past year has taught me a lot," she began, her voice soft but clear. "It's taught me that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about moving forward even when you're scared. It's taught me that change doesn't happen overnight, but every little bit counts. And most importantly, it's taught me that none of us are alone. Whether it's family, friends, or strangers who care, we're all connected." By the time she finished, the crowd erupted into applause, cheering until their voices grew hoarse. Tasha stepped back, overwhelmed but proud. For the first time, she truly believed that her story had made a difference, not because it was special, but because it reminded people of their shared humanity. As the sun set over the park, casting golden light across the mural, residents lingered, reluctant to leave. Some danced to music played by local musicians, while others sat quietly, reflecting on how far they'd come. Kids ran around laughing, oblivious to the weight of the moment, but proof that the future was bright. Officer Reynolds stood near the edge of the crowd, watching silently. He didn't join in the festivities, but he didn't need to. Just being there felt like a step in the right direction. As he turned to leave, a young boy tugged at his sleeve. "Are you the cop who messed up?" the boy asked bluntly, his eyes wide. Reynolds knelt down, meeting the child's gaze. "Yeah, I am," he admitted. "But I'm trying to do better. That's all any of us can do." The boy studied him for a moment, then grinned. "Okay, cool." Later that night, as the stars twinkled overhead, Tasha's family sat on their porch sipping hot chocolate and talking about the day. Her father wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "What do you think, kiddo?" he asked gently. "Worth it?" She thought for a moment, gazing out at the quiet street. Then she smiled. Yeah, it was worth it. And maybe that was the best anyone could hope for. A reminder that even in the hardest moments, there was always room for growth, connection, and healing. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as long as they kept walking it together, they'd find their way.